we go.
Hey, Professor, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Ben. How are you doing today?
I am good. Let me just make sure that I have the proper amount of light and color to get me through this grueling session we're about to dive into.
A struggle session.
Oh, is it? All right. Well, if it is, then you're the professor, so you're the one who's going to be standing in the corner, and I'll be the one whacking you with my little red book.
Oh, geez, no.
No?
Maybe we'll do something else then.
Okay, we'll improvise. I was looking through the WLU website, and I couldn't find your actual position. So I after getting quite a bit of very astute critique about me not introducing my guests, I need to do that. I need to do better. So this is Jordan Goldstein or Goldstein, which is confusing to me now because Brett Weinstein is always correcting his last name. So
it's a temperamental thing. For me, it would be Steen.
Steen, so okay. Goldstein.
I would be the opposite of Stein.
And you're a professor, an associate professor at the infamous or famous Wilfrid Laurier Waterloo campus.
Yes.
And what do you teach?
Oh, no, it's assistant.
Assistant. Oh, you're assistant.
Yeah.
I stopped reading after the second S.
Yeah, I am the lowest of the low.
So how are things going on campus this year? I kind of wanted to talk to you about your perspective on the events, because what happened at Laurier, if anybody doesn't know, is that there's this she's even lower than an assistant professor because she was just a TA.
Yes.
Lindsay Shepherd got into some trouble for playing a 3-minute television clip in class.
Yeah, public access television clip.
A public access, probably funded by the government, or at least by the public.
Yeah, TV Ontario, which is our provincial broadcaster. And
it was so incendiary that she got pulled aside and for 40 minutes was inquisitioned, if there's a verb for that, by 3 professors. Well, 2 professors and 1 representative of the equity office.
Yes. Diversity and equity office.
Yeah. And then that blew up, and then there was a bunch of free speech issues on campus with certain groups saying that they're getting a lot of hate. And then Lindsay starts this, controversial speaker or contentious speaker series, and she gets a lot of heat from a lot of different people. And Jordan Peterson somehow gets involved, and now she just issued a lawsuit. Not that you can talk about that, but I'm just filling in the blanks. Lindsay Shepherd just issued a lawsuit against the university based on discrimination or harassment?
Workplace harassment.
It
essentially is the basis of her suit because she is an employee of the university, and they have employer obligations that they failed to uphold. And her statement of claim, which is untested in court, is online, and you can read about the. I guess what I would say would be almost like a systemic level of harassment against her by her department, which we were following along with on campus. For those of us who had been, I guess, a little bit more inside in terms of the free speech battle at Laurier, we knew of the difficulties that Lindsay was facing against her department, and just in a professional manner, it never seemed right to me. And that was the thing that really disturbed me about that tape, that recording, was that it was so unprofessional, the way those professors acted in their capacity as her supervisors. They had positions of authority over her. They abused it. And then she was never given the proper redress by the university. And funny enough, they exonerated her. They said she ended up doing nothing wrong. The meeting should never have happened. And you would think after that was made in December, I believe, that the university would have tried to rectify the situation, that they might have tried to calm the divisions within that particular department. But it seems as if the department was just allowed to, and the professors within the department were allowed to target and make life pretty difficult for Lindsay, professors and students. in that communication studies department. So that's more of the basis of her suit against the university. It's employee relations. To the best of my knowledge, I could have that wrong, but to the best of my knowledge, that's the basis of that suit.
Well, I was following the story pretty closely at that time, up until probably January. But I noticed like the pattern of behavior on the administration level is that even though they exonerated Lindsay, they did it in the most hedge our bets sort of way. Their language was always very crafted, not to offend, and just to kind of quiet everything down, but not really take a stand on any position. And then they formed a free speech committee or something that was going to look and research maybe the Chicago principles, something like that.
Yes, part of the administrative response to the whole situation, there were two. There was a fact-finding investigation to find out what actually happened in the tutorial in question that caused Lindsay to be brought in front of her supervising professor and the program director and that representative from the Diversity and Equity Office. But the second was, as you mentioned, the creation of a task force on freedom of expression, which I tried to serve on. But it was voted on by other faculty, and I didn't make the grade. But the task force, they met for a couple months. They tried to hammer out a statement. There were those of us who were very adamant that they simply just adopt the Chicago-style statement, the University of Chicago statement on free expression. We ended up producing a document that was about twice as long in length, which I take as a little bit of a victory, because if you look at other Canadian universities that have tried this, notably the University of British Columbia, they produced a document maybe 5 times in length, and it eventually had to get scrapped because the president was very unsatisfied with the way it turned out. But just to go back to our freedom of expression task force, it sort of followed the pattern of trying to play both sides that you had just outlined, that the administration's strategy seemed to be targeted towards. Those of us on the free speech side, we saw problems, we saw faults in it, and those on the social justice, the security side, they, I think, had far more issues with the statement than we did. And so the statement was accepted, it was approved by our Senate, but the one member of the task force who was very adamant for free speech, Dr. David Haskell, who's been very public in his support of Lindsay and very public in his displeasure at the university. He ended up leaving the task force because he didn't think that the university was serious about implementing it. And he cited a brand new policy that the university brought in that forces student groups to pay for security costs for speakers that are brought in.
Yeah, I remember Lindsay tweeting out about them having to pay like 11,000 Canadian or something like that for security for one of their events.
Yeah, it was there were 2 events in question. One of the first event, it was sort of an offshoot of another event that Lindsay tried to hold with the student group. It was sort of a student in public group that she formed, the Laurier Society for Open Inquiry. She attempted to bring in a controversial speaker who was going to talk about immigration.
Faith Goldie, is it?
Faith Goldie, yes. And this attracted a lot of publicity, a lot of attention, demonstrations, and the talk eventually was it was basically canceled by heckler's veto. Somebody pulled the fire alarm, and everybody was escorted out. So Lindsay tried to bring Faith Goldie back to a different university, and that university played the sort of runaround, and they ended up increasing their security fee to, I think it was just south of or just north of $28,000. So they didn't pay that, so that talk didn't go on. And so Lindsay tried to bring another speaker in, a professor from Mount Royal University in Calgary, Dr. Francis Widdowson, to talk about efforts in Canadian universities at including Indigenous types of knowledge. They call it indigenizing the university or indigenizing education. And the university asked for just about $5,500 of security fee because we've got 2 local Antifa chapters in Kitchener and Waterloo, which are the sort of twin cities that Laurier is located in, and they had promised to show up and cause a bit of a problem. Yeah. And so the university decided that it was the students who were putting on the talk that were going to have to bear the brunt of these extra security fees. So it's essentially a type of a censorship where students who are going to bring in speakers that are going to induce people to violently protest have to pay for the costs of the violent protesters. And if you've been following along with campus politics, the vast majority of violent protests on university are from leftist students, left-leaning students protesting against right-leaning or libertarian speakers. Now, that's not always the case, but it's predominantly that way. So in effect, the university's commitment to protecting all perspectives and diverse opinions, which were directly in that freedom of expression statement, seemed to be undermined by another policy that they had just enacted. So that was when Dr. Haskell threw up his hands and said, they're not serious about this. And that's sort of been the administration strategy, I think, is just to try to play all sides until it blows over, which is a fairly standard administrative response and understandable. It's understandable. I think it's the wrong policy
mentality. This is something interesting. One of the people who was in the room with Lindsay Shepherd was Dr. Pimlott, Herbert Pimlott. And I did an episode on my YouTube channel where I just went exclusively through what he said to her. And I did some research on him. And some of the research I didn't published, and I'm waiting for somebody else to publish that research. But the stuff that I did find him teaching was basically activism studies, radicalism studies. So what you possibly have is professors radicalizing students that then go out and intimidate other professors and other viewpoints. And so you have this you almost have a cause and effect. I don't think you can prove it in a court of law or anything like that, but it lends itself to some very suspect behavior. By the leftist or the more radical, whichever side, the more radical professors are instituting something that then is on the students to raise a bunch of funds to protect themselves from.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a sort of a pattern that we've seen across North American universities. It's the students that are going out and perpetrating these protests, some of which are completely legitimate and peaceful and within the realm of fair protest, and others which cross the line into violence or intimidation or no platforming. But it's always professors. There are professors behind the scenes that go out and they seemingly do seem to tell the students that that this is an acceptable way to voice what you're learning in the classroom, as you say, activism studies. And there are many professors, and you simply just have to go and read their bios, as you did with this one professor. But it's not just in isolation, and you can see which ones are dedicated to promoting a specific agenda or an ideology or a political idea, as opposed to those who are more interested in sort of the word that's coming to my mind is benign, but that's not the right word. More benign research or traditional styles of research. More fact-based and stuff. So it seems like there's a dual problem with these radical professors. They teach activism, so they teach behaviors as acceptable that are very disruptive. And then at the same time, they teach that other ideas are unacceptable and disruptive. So it's okay for you to shout and shut down speakers if they're saying these groups these words over here they're harmful. And one of the student groups on campus that I've been kind of on their case with is the people who run the Rainbow Center, which is the trans and LGBTQ community center. And
I've had to say this over and over again. I have nothing wrong with actual LGBTQ people. It's the activists that are using the scarcity of that demographic and their historical oppression to justify them going around and oppressing or assuming that they can control the conversation because there's all this transphobia on campus. There's all these incidents of transphobia, and for some reason they think that they don't have to provide proof. They've never provided proof that there was transphobic incidences. But if you go back to what Lindsay got in trouble for, she got in trouble for showing something that expressed differing views from the accepted, orthodoxy of the trans community, the trans activist community. So that could be just expressing a view can be construed as transphobia. Therefore, they're justified in saying that we need more police and less speech. Or I don't even know if they want police because maybe they don't like the police, but that's an evergreen thing.
It's very similar. Not as dire, I think, as what's going on at Evergreen, but certainly the demand for resources is something we hear quite a lot.
What do you mean by resources, or what do they mean by resources?
Resources in terms of, just to give an example, when we had the freedom of expression it was disseminated to the university community, and then they held a town hall meeting where people could come and ask questions to the committee members, which was fine. And as I mentioned before, when this was produced, people on sort of both sides, the free speech and the social justice side, neither were really happy, but the people on the social justice side were much more agitated about the statement. And most of the speakers that came up to talk that day were speaking from that side, and almost all of them talked about, well, if we are going to have this policy, it's going to mean that speakers are going to be coming and discriminating or spreading hate speech against trans or marginalized people. And given that we've already lived through the trauma of what's gone on already, we don't have the monetary resources to deal with student complaints and concerns. So what we need is more monetary resources for the Diversity and Equity Office, the Rainbow Center, to hire more people for more space, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, if the Rainbow Center and the equity, let's just say the equity conglomerate within the institution, they can demand all these resources from the institution. But student groups have to raise their money from outside of the institution. So why isn't there like a conservative corner or conservative centre for the conservatives to like get money from the institution to do these things? Has there been a move for that?
Some of the idea, I mean, we toss around ideas, and we had thought about creating a sort of, instead of like a free speech, it would have been just as there's an office for diversity and equity, that there would also be an office created for the protection of freedom expression. But creating an extra bureaucracy is not necessarily the way, I think, to move forward to deal with the problems associated with another bureaucracy. Well,
yeah, if your opponents are using the institution, though, how do you combat that other than crowdsourcing? I guess
it's very tricky, and crowdsourcing was unfortunately the way in which we were able to cover those initial security fees. But it's not a solution we want to go to, because then they're just going to keep upping the fees, and it's going to say, well, this is it's an okay practice for the university to say to student groups who want to bring in a speaker who others are going to violently protest at, that no, it's on you. It's the blaming the victim argument, which is not the correct thing. And the university should be the ones stepping up and protecting the rights of students or professors to bring in speakers if they choose. And they should be the ones to cover those security costs, like many universities in the States have. Famously, you see at Cal Berkeley how fast they turned. They had the famous riots when Milo Yiannopoulos was supposed to show up. And then I forget how many months later Ben Shapiro was going to show up, and they covered I think it was $600,000 of security, $600,000 of security costs for Ben Shapiro to speak. But the university itself paid those costs.
Yeah.
And that shows their dedication and commitment to protecting freedom of expression and free speech. Whereas when you offload that cost to the student groups putting on the speech, you're not really showing a commitment. You're kind of hoping that they won't pay and that the whole thing will go away.
But the thing is, one of the reasons that Lindsay is, I'm going to theorize, but she had a lot of attention for her story, and I can see how that would spark a lot of the problems that she had within her department and with the admin and stuff. So hers is a very peculiar case, a very special case, because of the amount, how huge she got overnight, right?
Yes.
You have absolutely. A TA being invited to Harvard and Berkeley. It's totally unheard of. She very special circumstance, but because of that, there was extra attention on both within her opponents had more attention and more reason to be fearful or angry with her, or even envious if we want to get psychological. And then there's a lot of influence from the outside world bearing down upon this small college. It's a pretty small college, right?
Yes. Yeah, relatively small.
Yeah. So
it's about 15,000 students. So it's not tiny, but it's not one of the larger institutions in the province. It
seems like there's all these different feedback loops. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's that Lindsay Shepherd brings a lot of attention onto the campus. The way that her department treats her gives her more fodder to show exactly how bad it is, which then leads the institution into trying to quash or trying to control this by offloading security, but then that brings even more attention, more money, and then gives the activists or whoever these people are more reason to say, what about us? What about us? What about us?
Yeah, I think that's a good read on the situation. And Lindsay herself is no shrinking violet. I mean, she has pushed the agenda forward at Laurier. So it's not as if this was all sort of an exogenous thing. She has really, especially in the second semester, when if you can, put yourself into her shoes, she's in a department where everybody essentially dislikes her and is hostile towards her. She decides to stick it out, and the reason is that she's willing to sort of stick her heels in it and fight back, which many people are not willing to do. And as you said, she is a special case, and you can't take her out of the equation in what has intensified this entire situation as well.
One idea, and then I had a question for you, but I was thinking, the offices of diversity should be rebranded the offices of infantilization, and then there should be the offices of resiliency to equalize the equation. I'm just wondering, why are students not being given spaces to get stronger, to get less fragile, rather than being given spaces to become more fragile? I know that's kind of unfair, because I do see the need for certain groups to have a place to go and be safe, but it seems like it can very easily turn into a hostile environment or a toxic environment if not managed correctly.
Yeah, I mean, when you have a balkanization of people, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, the potential for hostilities to be created in between the groups certainly becomes exacerbated. Speaking to the notion of resiliency versus sort of protection, I mean, I can't speak beyond my own experience, but in Ontario, our public school system has done a pretty good job of coddling our students all the way up from elementary to high school. And so it might be a reflection of those larger trends, I think, in cross education. Now, again, I can only sort of speak to what's happening a little bit more in Ontario, but that might have something to do with it, I think.
Yeah. One of the things we spoke about a few months ago is your research into sportsmanlike behavior. Are you you're still advancing in that?
A little bit. I've sort of moved off of that particular strand of research for right this second, just because I'm finding it hard to bring it all together into a project that I can sort of put my hands around right now, and it's a little outside of my academic expertise as well. So, because I'm a.
What's your precise academic expertise?
I'm a trained historian.
Okay.
So I was dabbling a little more in philosophy and psychology and into some more biology as well, and trying to feed those in with my knowledge of history, which was really rewarding. And I still really want to do something with what I was sort of scratching. But in terms of putting it all together, it's been a little trying, and I don't have the time right now. Just had our first child a couple months ago, so things are a little thanks. Things are a little busy at our house right now when it comes to that.
I bring that up because when we spoke, you talked about the British culture of sportsmanlike behavior and the Greek culture of sportsmanlike behavior. I'm truncating. It was a long time ago, but
yes.
I'm just wondering if in your research and your learning about those two cultures, how can we apply sportsmanlike behavior to the problems on campus when it comes to contentious issues and even balkanized groups? How do we create an arena of diversity on the intellectual sphere at the universities, and how can we use lessons from what you were talking about, like with sportsmanlike behavior, to guide us?
That's a really good question. The thing that initially pops into my mind is the notion of competency, and it sort of ties into the discussion we were sort of having on resiliency, because the notion of the athlete in the Greek and British sense, and they're not completely similar, but they're related, is that the athlete is not someone just physically competent, but their character and their moral standing is also bound up in that competence. So if we are to apply the lessons, it would almost be for different groups that want to come together and sort of in the spirit of free inquiry, be competent in your arguments, be rigorous. That sense of physical competency tied with character strength and morality, you might think of translating that into an academic sense as come with your evidence, right? Be prepared to admit that you're wrong, and learn something, because the athlete knows that they're not always going to perform the very best, but they train as if they have to. And the notion is that you want to try to reach forward to that potential. You may not necessarily reach it, but you're always striving, and you're always using it. You're always using the lessons and the failures to get stronger, to get better, to come back the next time. So I guess it would be adopting maybe the attitude of a more holistic type of education, where we don't just walk into one class, learn the absolute truth, and then go and spread it. Mm-hmm. But we come with that sense of a humble ignorance when we debate, when we come to talk to people maybe on the other side of an issue. Now, we want to maybe best them, right? We want to show that our arguments are better, but we don't want to do it in a malicious way. We don't want to do it in an underhanded way. We don't want to cheat. Just as the athlete who's moral doesn't want to win by cheating. They don't want to take substances. They don't want to go around the rules. And even if they do and they win, it's like there's no honor in that type of victory, right? And maybe that's what we need. We need honor to be restored to a sense of intellectual debate. As in, we're not just going to shout down. We're not just going to declare our side has the right argument, and we're not going to listen to anybody counter because we know we've got the truth. So maybe that's the way I can best analogize it. That's sort of what pops into my mind right off the bat, if that seems to make a little bit of sense.
It does. I like you brought up the notion of striving, how the athlete is always striving, and it seems like it seems from my research and my limited understanding of progressivism is that they are striving, but the striving is somehow gets abstracted from striving to become a better person, but it's rather striving to institute the best society. It's like this outward striving to change society. And I guess in a certain respect, like Alexander the Great was striving to change the world, but every one of his warriors had to be striving to be the best that they could in order to affect his will into the world.
Yes. When it comes to progressives, and I think you're right, that there is a substitution for individual and collective striving. But another thing that I think is the athlete is not so much interested in progress all the time. Maybe that's not the right way, because progressive and progress implies an end goal, right? You progress towards an end state. There is an end in mind, whereas the word that I tend to substitute for progress is improvement, which takes into consideration the notion of getting better, but we don't necessarily know exactly where we're going to end up. We might not ever get there, but we're still going to try to improve. So for progressives, it's that moving towards the revealed truth of how we must organize our society in order to collectively flourish together. Whereas someone in a more individualist ideology might think, well, I'm going to try to improve myself to the best that I can be, and hopefully that will provide the example for others to then improve themselves, and then we can generally improve together. So I guess the notion then of the athlete, and this is particularly the notion of sort of like an amateur athlete, maybe that ties more to the improvement, right? Because it's not to win or to lose, but it's to essentially do your best. Whereas when we think of an athlete, we might think of a professional who thinks, run a race in a certain amount of time, win a certain amount of medals, go pro, make a certain amount of money. So
there is an end.
Maybe that's the way we can think about it, because certainly when talking about the athlete as a moral guide, we're talking specifically about an amateur and not a professional. And both the Greeks and the Brits were very clear about that once you become a professional, you lose that. You lose that moral essence of being an athlete, and you've substituted the intrinsic motivations you should be striving towards for an external motivation and an external goal. Now, I don't know if that perfectly analogizes to the sort of individual or collective aspiration of an individualist versus a progressive, but maybe there's some confluence there.
Some overlay. The idea that both the individualist and the team player, let's say, the notion, one thing to keep in mind is that I think one of the problems with progressivism right now is that we are receiving a huge rush, or like this whole generation of progressives have arrived on the scene, and so there's just some inherent faults with their behavior just based on their youth, not necessarily their ideals, right? One of their problems is idealism, wanting it all now, not understanding like incremental change is the change that actually persists, and dramatic change is that which actually just completely screws up the system and stuff like that. So I wonder, as an educator, how long have you been teaching now? For quite a few,
not too many. This would be, I just finished my third year of teaching at the first university level.
And you're a historian, but you're in the sports medicine department, or in the
kinesiology department.
Okay. So you have a lot of people who are training to work with bodies, and you're putting time into their head. I often, because I teach a first year introductory class, and I get the students usually to raise their hand and ask who's primarily interested in the sciences and who's primarily interested in the humanities, and nobody raises their hand for the humanities. It's all science inclined students, which is great. I think it's a really neat role actually that I get to provide as a sort of an embedded humanities professor within a science-based program, because it gives the students a chance to learn a little bit more about the area, and it gives them also different skills that they're not learning in their other classes. Writing skills, reading comprehension skills, not thinking critically, but real critical thinking skills, weighing 2 or 3 arguments at the same time, looking at the relative merits and strengths of one versus the other, and deciding which one you buy. So those types of things, and giving them a certain cultural context for the profession that they're likely to go into, whether that be occupational therapy, physiotherapy, coaching, management, etc. So it's actually been very rewarding, and I feel, this is a little off topic, and when you see the humanities sort of like the sinking ship that they are,
you wonder if this isn't sort of a future place for a lot of scholars, to be embedded into different faculties. I have a colleague of mine who studied international history and political history, and he makes the point that a lot of the traditional political historians are moving into business or finance or policy departments. And so you're seeing almost like a migration of humanities professors out of the humanities who aren't really towing along the ideological line that the rest of the humanities department seems to be falling into. And I think that's positive because, well, the humanities right now, they're not in very good shape. And as a historian, it's really sad because history as a department and a discipline has been one of the last to really fall because we had such a strong methodology. But that's now unfortunately been going to the wayside as well. So you're seeing a lot of exodus.
What do you see? Are you able to describe somewhat the change, like starting with the methodology that held history to a different standard and what it's being replaced by and what it's initiated that change?
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak a little bit to that, but a lot of it has to do with the rise of sort of social history and cultural history in the 1960s, which is not necessarily a bad thing. You had a different perspective, people wanting to look in a different way. And certainly I think what's really good about history is there's space for everybody, conservatives, liberals, Marxists, socialists, libertarians, anarchists, you name it. Because no historian works with complete knowledge, and we sort of need as many different perspectives. But the thing that generally kept history so good and that kept all of these people in the same department together, whether they agreed politically or not, was that the sources, the evidence is what matters. As long as you've got good primary source and you're relaying a lot of evidence-based analysis, well, yeah, your own personal perspective is going to be something, but we can debate that. And it was really the focus on finding the primary sources, going and doing the heavy archival research, and then presenting that archival research. What I see a lot more of is picking the way you're going to analyze a problem before you've gone and analyzed it. So the social and cultural theorists, and there was a brilliant interview with Neil Ferguson, who's a pretty accomplished historian in his own right, but he was talking on Dave Rubin's show, and that's a great interview. But in the first 20 minutes, he lays out one of the best descriptions of how history as a discipline fell. And it's not so much as a nefarious takeover as it was these newer professors from the cultural and social side. They really invested a lot in training new students and in sort of planning for them to take up the mantle, whereas the conservative historians, the ones who focus maybe a little bit more on politics and war than social and cultural issues, they didn't really engage in that. And it was almost like attrition, right? Until the conservative or non sort of cultural historian didn't have anybody left to replace them, and you were just left with cultural and social historians who now dominate. So it wasn't so much of I don't think it's as much of a nefarious takeover as it might seem. And I think he does a good job of describing how that process took over. It's just they had a little bit more foresight about perpetuating their perspective throughout the academy.
A more Darwinian game plan.
Yes, yeah, which in a sense I can definitely respect that. I think it's made history a worse discipline because we don't have that ideological diversity that we did have. And it was good to see a challenge rise up towards the older, more conservative historians in the 60s and the 70s, whether you agreed with their analysis or not. I mean, that's what you want at a university. That's what you want in an academic discipline. You want rigor, you want challenge, you want people to stand up and disagree with each other, not so much in a political sense, but on an evidence sense. And it seems as if we've lost that, which is really unfortunate.
How was your time in school when you were learning or becoming a professor? Did you start liberal and become disenchanted with it, or start like a Marxist and turn into a libertarian or something like that?
That's exactly what happened. Started as a Marxist. Oh yeah, big time. That was in high school. I was a big Marxist in high school, coming out of high school into university, and then I sort of tempered that that sort of radical streak and just became a sort of a solid progressive. And I was probably solid progressive through my entire undergrad and master's program, which was not really ideological. The department I was in was very good. We had a lot of good professors, conservative professors, progressive, liberal professors, and no one really taught overly from an ideological position, which was good. For me, I started to change my personal thinking after I was sort of out of my master's and before I went into my PhD. And it had to do with one of the reasons I was a staunch progressive and a radical was because of my anti-war politics.
Okay, yeah.
I sort of grew up, I was in high school for 9/11 and the Iraq War, and that sort of galvanized me politically, and that's still a big part of my politics. And when I saw progressives and Democrats who I'd allied myself with not really caring about the anti-war stuff that they had once they were in power, and I'd always been kind of an anti-political, anti-partisan kind of a person, I just saw the hypocrisy. So I started to look to more independent voices and people who were talking about the things that I was talking about. And especially the anti-war stuff. So that sort of started to change. And then I learned a bit of economics, which I didn't really learn too much in terms of microeconomics and free market stuff. And that just put me on the path to when I was just about to enter my PhD, I was almost completely turned.
Really?
Yeah.
So now you carry around a copy of Atlas Shrugged wherever you go? Is that where you're at now?
I've never read Atlas Shrugged.
I'm
never read it.
I just want to know how far you went.
Oh, in terms of where I stand now?
Yeah, where do you stand now? Do you think?
I always have a hard time. I always have a hard time because I don't think you ever want to stop on a stable position. I would classify myself as a radical classical liberal. Okay. Somewhere between a minarchist and an anarchist. I'm sympathetic to anarcho-capitalism, not anarcho-syndicalism. I'm sympathetic to the arguments, although practically I don't think that's the way you want to go in our society at this moment. Yeah. So philosophically, I tend, and that's why I use the moniker radical, because I like to go almost as far as I can with an idea in terms of the theory, but practically that's not the thing that I would advocate for. Even though I understand if you're in one position or the other, it does change dramatically how you approach politics in the political world.
How has being at Wilfrid Laurier over the past year affected your political leanings? Have you felt yourself go into a reactionary mode, or have you remained kind of skeptical of politics itself? Or
I'm very skeptical of politics. I'm skeptical of those who lust for and want power over others. Very, very skeptical of the motives and their intentions, and I generally don't trust people who want to have that power over others. It comes from my historical understanding of what happens when people do get that power. I guess one of the things that's happened is I've come into contact with more what you might call traditional conservatives than I had ever in the past. Now, I'm not sure if my views have become more conservative. It's almost you say the word reactionary, and I guess that's almost what's happened. But it's almost that's like what everyone else is experiencing when we're facing the sort of the radicalism from the politically correct types. Everyone is sort of reacting to them at this point. And so everyone's kind of getting pushed. So maybe it's pushed me a little bit towards more conservative positions. I'm not sure. Maybe that's old age. maybe that's just getting older and
having a baby.
Having a baby does have that effect. So I haven't sat down and really thought about how that's affected my beliefs. I'm sure they have, and I would assume they're in that direction. But I think that everyone is kind of getting pushed that way right now, so it's hard to say.
Yeah. I mean, I was in the middle of Evergreen State College when it erupted, and I came into Evergreen pretty, I guess, Obama-y and on the progressive end of things, though I never really liked politics or the labels, but experiencing the radicalism take root and watching the ideas at the core of progressivism be either taken in the wrong way or taken all the way, I don't know, I still don't know, has caused me to really start to look into politics and find that I'm conservative over here and I'm progressive over there, but I'm very skeptical of people in power, but at the same time we need people in power. So like, how do we solve that problem? How do we lift up the philosopher kings, which will never work? Like, there's any planning happens on a national level or political level. It's doomed for failure. And that's why I need to do more research into the founding fathers of America and how I think it was Madison, I believe, that the architect of the government set them all against each other. That was the best way to do it, instead of having, in order to mitigate any given power structure, you set the power structures against each other.
The balance, or the separation of powers.
Separation, and then the pitting of powers against each other. I just wonder if there's a way to implement some sort of creative tension into campuses, into public debate, not to go around and make everything good and say we need to be peaceful and stuff like that. Maybe that's not the answer. Maybe it's like, we just need to reconfigure how our energies, our anger, our rage, our greed, our lust are pitting us against each other, and see if we can't orient ourselves in all these things that make us go through the world in a way that's more constructive rather than whatever is going on right now.
Yeah, and it would be good if people could realize that the person on the other side likely is coming from the same place in terms of motivations, right? Everybody, what drives most people is wanting to make things better for everybody, right? There's very few people in the world that generally set out in the morning to say, I want to make life as miserable as possible for other people. We all kind of want to get to the same place where people have the ability in their lives, to have a good living, to live in a safe environment, and to basically do the things that they want to do, unencumbered. Most people, that's all of our end goal. We just disagree on how to get there. So if we could just remember that might go a long way, as opposed to, you disagree with me on this issue, therefore you're morally suspect. Yeah.
Or any other nasty name.
Yeah. Or I agree with you on 9 out of 10 things, but on this one thing that you slightly disagree with me on, it casts you completely outside, and now we have to put you on the outside because you don't agree with lockstep every single thing that we do. And you see this problem on all sides of the political spectrum. I think for me, the big fear is not so much the activism of the left, because I don't think the public has any appetite for those solutions in any sort of grand sense. My big fear is that they are going to provoke a big enough reaction of the type that we've seen that the public has accepted, in terms of, say, a nationalist or an ethnic nationalist type of a backlash, where a majority culture decides they've just had enough of being talked about in a certain way, and they're going to move in the same identity sphere that the minorities have been operating in. And it's that fear of a majority identity politics that really is really terrifying to me, because I don't think that the social justice advocates have a lot of broad public support for some of their more radical ideas. But if they can anger up enough people to sort of get back into that parochial nationalistic mindset, that would be a really bad thing. And that's the thing that I'm more afraid of that. I'm more afraid of the backlash I think they're creating than of themselves. Although they do pose a danger, that's for sure.
The same fear I see operative in the strongest, well, not maybe not the strongest, but some of the opponents of Lindsay Shepherd have accused her of basically being a Nazi because there's a statistical likelihood that people who are Nazis follow her on Twitter, right? So they're evoking the same thing using Lindsay as the icon. Lindsay, yep. A very fascinating case. Like once it's all blown over, just her as an icon, not as a person, but as an icon, yep. Galvanizing for both pro and con her. But have you seen that in the events on campus that there is a growing presence of nationalism or of any of these ethno-white nationalists coming on, and if not, have you started to brainstorm or think of ways to like curb that from forming, being on the not progressive side?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's tough to say, and I know that the opponents would certainly disagree with my characterization of it, because they would view things like the Faith Goldie talk or the Dr. Francis Widdowson talk as evidence of growing ethnic nationalism or white nationalism. But then that assumes that just because somebody brings somebody in to speak, they automatically endorse and agree with their positions, which I know is not the case. So in terms of students organizing themselves, I haven't seen anything. The only thing I see in terms of radical protest would be from sort of the Antifa, or there's a socialist collective as well. And they show up in masks, but they haven't really done anything. Yeah. They haven't
fire alarm.
Yeah, we don't know who pulled the fire alarm. If the university would have investigated that and maybe tried to censor the person who did it, because it is a criminal offense, number one. And it also goes against the university's policy of, allowing events to unfold peacefully. But we don't know who pulled it. It could have been one of them. It could have been somebody from communications department. Could have been somebody from Faith Goldie's team trying to just up her publicity. Like we don't know. We don't know who pulled it. And there was never an attempt to figure out who did it, which maybe is a little more disappointing. Yeah. But we certainly haven't seen increased actual violence, not from the sort of the Antifa. They've shown up with masks to two times on our campus, but they haven't done anything other than shout some annoying and banal slogans. Yeah. So that's really it. So I haven't seen that ratcheting up on campus. But in terms of if I were to see what I view as real ethnic nationalism or or a white supremacist uprising, I would be one of the first people to openly declare it as something we need to monitor, to get rid of, or to at least show it for what it is. Maybe not get rid of it. It's tricky. As a Jewish person who has Holocaust survivors and people who perished in the Holocaust, I'm certainly not someone who's going to cheer on a big identity politics of a majority ethnic culture in a country, because I know how bad that ends up, and it's not something I promote, and it's not something that the people that I have associated with at the university also promote. Like with the Laurier Society of Open Inquiry, they oftentimes get labeled as a white supremacist organization, which is it's ludicrous. It's people from the outside who don't know anything about the situation say, well, they bring in this person to speak, therefore they must support them, therefore they must want to promote these ideas. Whereas, to go back a little bit to Lindsay, and this is just my own personal take, she herself is a very tough customer, and she herself, I think, decided to really pick some people that would be difficult for the university to stomach, to see what their commitment was. Yeah. To really push the buttons and to push the idea of free speech, which I'm which I do agree with that, because free speech means the most reprehensible ideas get the same. They don't necessarily deserve a platform, but if somebody wants to provide a platform for them, we don't get to go and shut them down just because we don't agree and they're reprehensible and awful.
But after they speak, you're more than welcome to break down their argument.
Yes, and that was I know that the first Faith Goldie talk, there was a lot of time left for Q&A, and that was the point, was to let her talk, and then we're going to vigorously challenge what she has to say. And the original idea was that she wanted her to debate against a professor on immigration, somebody who was pro-immigration, so that the professor could present the alternative side and hopefully dispel or debunk some of the more noxious ideas, if that's what she was going to present. But none of the professors were willing to do that. That she asked. So it ended up being a single forum instead, which was not the intention. It wasn't the intention of the society to do that. They wanted a back and forth. They wanted an exchange. It just, the other side never showed up. So maybe that goes back to that notion of how do we translate that athlete morality? Well, the athlete would say, I'm going to show up, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to show up, and I'm going to bring my competence with me, and I'll trust my competence on that day, right? It's like it's like the person who brags about, I'm so good at, we'll just use basketball as an example. Like, I'm so good at basketball. I practice in my driveway for hours, and I'm such a great shooter. And then you ask them, okay, we're going to go play pickup. Do you want to come? And then you say, I can't, right? And they never seem to bring their game to where it matters, right? They always talk about how good their game is. Like the practice player who can't perform. Well, the athlete is someone who's supposed to be able to perform when they need to. Yeah. And maybe that's another mentality, is we should want to face the people who we disagree with the most. We should want to face the bogeyman who presents the arguments that we think are fallacious, or that they're strawmanning, or they're demagoguing. If we're so confident in our argument, we should be able to go up right beside them and defeat them.
Yeah. Yeah. The whole, the same day or the day after Lindsay's case went public, Jordan Peterson's case of LaBelle went public.
Yes.
And I think it's against Laurier, but also Pimlott and Rambukkana and Joel.
Yes.
Who I think both. I'm sure Rambukkana likened him to Hitler, and I'm pretty sure that Pimlott did too. But I think Pimlott was more that he's a climate denier. I don't know. Pimlott's a really interesting guy. But it seems like this is a good instance of them like bitching about this person and shutting him up on campus. But then when it's time to like actually meet this guy face to face, like it seems like there's all these ways of not actually coming out and stating their case. I mean, I have not seen, and I understand why not, but I have not seen Rambukkana after that letter of apology to Lindsay come out and like state his case, or like really. But I understand, like, yeah, it's one thing to go and to debate, but it's another thing to step out when everybody's got a bunch of tomatoes to throw at you. So and to be fair to them, they didn't put themselves out there. They were sort of thrust without their that's true.
Without their it wasn't them who decided to go public with this. Yeah. So you can understand from their point of view why they might not want to be so public. It is understandable.
Yeah, I would never want to be in their position. That's why I upload everything I record to the internet right away, so everybody just knows exactly what I'm saying all the time.
Everyone's free to make their judgments.
Yeah, it's right there. And I'm used to at least the idea of people listening to everything I say.
Yeah, absolutely.